Good morning, everyone. We're going to be starting in just a minute. If one of the attendees wouldn't mind sharing the chat with me just real quick to verify that you can hear me okay and that everyone can see my slide screen, that'd be really appreciated. Thank you. Great. Thank you all so much. And yes, to a question that has already come up, the goal certainly is for this to be up on the Coalition's YouTube channel afterwards. So if you can't catch all of it, or if you have other people that want to look at it, or you want to revisit, that will be the goal. I will do the best I can to multitask and train while keeping an eye on your questions. But please, there will be time at the end. So if I don't respond to you in the moment, I promise there'll be time at the end. All right, well, let's get started, everyone. So good morning. I'm so happy you could all join today's training. Consequences, not punishment, the challenges and the solutions to enforcing rules in a trauma-informed environment. My name is Nathan Schulman, and I am the Director of Programs for the Tennessee Coalition. I've been with the Coalition now for over 2 years. Previously, I worked 6 years at a domestic violence shelter as both an advocate and manager. So I do have some experience both with the frontlines work as well as all the administrative leadership challenges that we know can come when trying to run a shelter. So today we are going to be defining a trauma-informed approach and why it's important when determining rules. We're going to talk about the role of rules in a trauma-informed space, and we're going to talk about how rules can be presented and enforced in a trauma-informed way. We're going to focus on rules in relation to residential programming, but these principles can certainly relate to other aspects of domestic violence services. As I said a moment ago, please keep track of any questions that you might have, as I'm happy to answer them to the best of my ability at the end. So before we go any further, I would love to hear from the audience how you would define a trauma-informed approach to working with survivors. If participants would like to share their thoughts in the chat or question box, whatever's easiest for you. Give everyone a moment. A place where love and support is given daily. I like that a lot. Anyone else have thoughts on how you would define a trauma-informed approach? Person-centered, absolutely. Empowering, yes. Yes, all good answers. Compassion, non-judgment. Support, support, support. Yes, yes, yes. This is a good group. I'm excited. Compassionately listening. Absolutely, absolutely. Victim, survivor centered always. I like that emphasis on always there, Jasmine. That's a good way of wording it. Anti-racist. Yes, yes. Especially, always relevant, but I'm glad that we're bringing it into the conversation right now. Understanding effects of trauma on the brain. Anti-ableist. Really great answers, everyone. So all of those answers are great, and absolutely all of them are on the money. So great job on that. To kind of give a more formal definition, a program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed, realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands the potential paths for recovery, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved in the system, responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. And because trauma has such an encompassing mental and physical effect on survivors, we really need to examine every aspect of our service delivery through that lens to successfully connect. And the subject of rules can be especially fraught when building an advocate-client relationship because they can resemble, mimic, or simply remind someone, of the power and control dynamics they experienced prior to arriving at shelter. Walking on eggshells is a common phrase used by survivors when describing home life with an abuser. The word that any wrong move, however seemingly random or insignificant, can result in punishment. We don't want our program's rules, even if they're well-intentioned. Okay, I'm hearing someone can't hear me. Is this any better? Just checking in. Can people hear me right now? Okay. Okay, great. Great. Just making sure there. I got a quick can't hear you, so I'm trying to be mindful of that as we go through this. So anyway, we don't want our program's rules, even if they're well intentioned, to have that effect of walking on eggshells. And swinging too far the other way can have a similar result. If there's residential conflict and survivors don't have faith that staff care enough to preserve everyone's safety, a survivor can feel the sensation of walking on eggshells around other residents. And this can be especially scary because unlike the relationship to their abuser, which is scary enough, there's so many more unknown qualities. Who is this aggressive stranger? What are they capable of? How do I keep myself safe in this strange shelter environment that they've come into? So keeping that in mind, rules are necessary for the general safety of a residential program. For example, they can set the standard that physical violence is unacceptable on any level, even as a threat, that drugs and weapons aren't allowed in the environment, and that following confidentiality rules are necessary to protect not just residents, but staff as well. So the key is to finding balance between rigidness and flexibility. So when assessing your program's rules, I found it helpful to separate out the quote-unquote deal breakers, rules that usually result in an exit from the program, from rules that ideally need to be followed, but if they're not, will initially result in just a discussion between staff and residents. Limiting deal breakers to an essential few preserves their seriousness, as well as being more manageable for residents to retain. They will ideally be tied to safety and remain fairly consistent. They stand above the numerous rules in place to help keep the shelter running smoothly. An example would be the difference between the rules no weapons on the property and clean up after yourself when using the kitchen. Both important, but very different stakes. So the consequences of not following them should reflect that. If you equate them, you're going to have residents either extremely anxious about their every action, afraid they're perpetually on the verge of being kicked out, or dismissive of all rules. And that doesn't necessarily mean that chronically leaving the kitchen a disaster couldn't result in the consequence of being asked to leave. It just needs to be a more extensive conversation with chances for correction. And every program needs to determine for themselves, what their community guidelines look like and how much leeway can be allowed before things start to break down. But as much flexibility as you can bring into it, it's going to be better off for all involved. So deal breakers can allow immediate consequences, but we can't let that dehumanize the particular situation at hand, because there could be some gray present in an otherwise black and white rule. So an example can be the deal breaker surrounding protecting a program's confidentiality. Obviously important, if a resident shares the location of the shelter they're staying at, it could lead to their abuser showing up and endangering multiple people. But let's say that someone calls the hotline and asks by name for a resident. Now, you could accept the black and white and tell that resident you have to leave. That's the rule, no exceptions. Clearly, you told someone about the shelter, and we said that's not allowed. But what if they then share that the person calling was their sister? She helped them get into your program. She's the only one who knew she's there. The resident's cell phone died, and the sister was worried, so she contacted the hotline, not knowing about the confidentiality rule, but wanting to make sure the sister was okay, and just knowing through the act of helping them get into the program, that's where they're at. That's an instance of a deal breaker being broken, but not resulting in anyone's safety being endangered. And for that reason, you could decide, quite fairly, to not exit the resident because it didn't affect anyone's safety, but stress that it can't happen again. Conversely, I'm sure someone could provide a specific scenario of an everyday programmatic rule being broken, that disregarded safety in a way where the only consequence that feels appropriate is exiting the resident. So rules set up structure, but we shouldn't be following any of them blindly, which is, probably a good approach to life in general. So we're looking for a balance. We need to be mindful of not fostering a controlling environment while ensuring that a structure is in place to keep everyone safe. And the key to that balance is thinking critically about what our rules are and how they're delivered. Throughout the whole process, we need to be mindful of the power differential is in place. Because odds are, no matter how trauma-informed and supportive your approach to working with residents is, no matter how great the report is, they will never lose sight of the fact that as staff, you hold a degree of power over whether this temporary roof above their heads can remain. That's a subtext that's going to be running underneath all interactions. So it's our job as advocates to be mindful of these power differentials and recognize the extra weight behind every rule being shared. Is the rule simple to explain and easy to retain? And that's really a crucial thing to consider when factoring in the effect that trauma has on memory, which requires, here a pretty cursory look at the biological effects of trauma. So the hippocampus is a small organ in the brain that helps an individual to record new memories, turning them from short-term to longer-term, and retrieves them later in response to specific and relevant environmental stimuli, essentially how our minds and memory works. It also helps to distinguish between past and present memories. The effects of PTSD literally shrinks the size of the hippocampus, sometimes by as much as 8%. And on top of this diminished ability, a survivor's brain takes on a huge effort trying to sort, calm, and organize the traumatic memories that led to the stress disorder in the first place. Often their minds are repeating past traumatic information in ways that are too overwhelming to distinguish quickly. And this can create almost ADHD-like symptoms, which can not only make memorization difficult, but can also affect the ability to learn or take on new information. Now, the good news is that hippocampus damage can be reversed over time, but it takes that time, and it benefits greatly from stability, which residents of an emergency shelter aren't likely going to achieve in the time span that you're working directly with them. They're in your shelter because they're a relatively new crisis, one would assume. So we shouldn't be asking too much of them in what they can realistically take. Continuing to look at the rules, do they serve a straightforward purpose? No weapons allowed on the premise is pretty straightforward. Weapons can harm, potentially kill others. That's an unacceptable risk for a program. Are the rules designed for everyone or in reaction to a specific instance? Given the amount of organized chaos being managed at a shelter, it's an understandable reaction for staff to see an issue and immediately think, let's make a rule to remove the issue. And yes, a new systemic problem can arise that requires a new rule. But first, I'd encourage you to ask yourself, is this rule really just for one specific resident? Is this rule unfair to a percentage of residents who have had nothing at all to do with the issue? You could try starting with specific arrangements or conditions for those having an issue rather than making it a blanket statement. Why add more general rules in when you don't have to? A common approach is to put up signs throughout a building or campus of a residential program, reiterating rules. And that can be very useful, though I'd encourage it to be reserved for the truly important daily reminders. The more notices and rule reminders you have plastered on the wall or corkboard, the more likely it's going to blur together and not catch anyone's eye unless they're really looking at it and trying to take in the information. Lastly, on this topic, if the easiest way to explain or enforce a rule is to say, because it's the rule, either the point of the rule or your messaging is off base. And keeping those power differentials in mind, it's the worst way to deliver structure. Because, the message can read, quite understandably to a resident, we make rules because we can and you better follow them, which is controlling rather than supportive. Focusing on eliminating unnecessary control is also a great opportunity to evaluate and address any staff burnout, because the two sometimes have a direct correlation. It takes a lot of energy, empathy, and patience to address the many needs, concerns, and crises in a shelter through a trauma-informed approach. When staff are burnt out, when they're feeling frustrated or overwhelmed, emphasizing rules is a way to feel in control of the situation. This reaction can also manifest in a heightened disciplinary vigilance, prioritizing the goal of catching residents breaking rules at the expense of helping others in the program. Now, I want to acknowledge that the word control is a loaded one in our field. And I'm certainly not equating this form of burnout with the power and control actions of a batterer. Residential work is really hard, some of the hardest work out there. And advocates can only do so much without the support of their management. So, if this burnout is manifesting in your program, the onus is on management to take the lead in solving this problem, as frontline staff have more than enough on their plates. So when should you talk with your residents about the rules in place at your program? The short answer is all the time. It needs to start, if at all possible, before it's even confirmed that they're coming into shelter. Once a survivor is considered eligible for your shelter, review all of the crucial expectations. Don't presume any rule is a no-brainer, and don't presume that they would automatically choose living with all of your program's rules over their current situation. That's where those ingrained power differentials can accidentally distort your perception, because living with rules is very different than being tasked with enforcing them. Make sure they understand that the consequences of failure to follow the rules could potentially result in an exit. If you sense any hesitation from the survivor when discussing expectations, check on that. Acknowledge that there are other resources available if something about the program doesn't seem to be the best fit for this person. We want to help people if we are the best people to be helping them. The other benefit to starting this discussion early and documenting that fact in your hotline call is if a resident had issue following the rules once they're in shelter, you can remind them of this discussed prior to them arriving. Not an "I told you so" kind of tone, but rather a gentle reminder, that these rules are taken very seriously by the program, and that their emphasis has nothing to do with any personal interaction that may have happened since they arrived, however contentious. To go back to the title of the webinar, you're framing the outcome of not following the rules as a natural consequence rather than a vindictive punishment of any kind. And then at intake, you want to review all the rules again with a survivor, as well as providing to them on paper. Don't assume since it was covered over the hotline, they have it internalized. The biological effects of trauma and memory aside, they're likely in full-on crisis mode and reaching out at the hotline for safety. It's possible they've agreed to things without really hearing them because all they could focus on was getting into your program. It's good practice to then double check that they don't have any questions about the rules after they've settled into your program. They have a practical sense of how it all works, the first 24 to 48 hours or so, either during the scheduled sessions that you might have with them, case management, or as staff catch them in passing. And then beyond that, you can talk about it as often as necessary. You don't want the rules to be driving all the conversations, of course, but we also don't want to avoid any, further reminders out of fear of being redundant. And then, as always, do your best to root the request in empathy. We need these rules to keep everyone in the program safe, which absolutely includes you. And then an important way to emphasize the logic and attempted fairness behind established rules of survivor while they're in your program is to advertise a grievance process, right off the bat, right at intake. This gives them an opportunity to speak with a member of management if they have any issue with any aspect of the program, including staff behavior. And it can be organized, it can be an organized form or simply a blank piece of paper to be written on. Either way, encourage the residents to include as many details as they want, because this formal outlet sends a clear message that warranted criticism is not ignored, and that residents won't be penalized for speaking up if they have any issues with provided services or the way your organization is structured. And when you think about the beginning of intake, when they first arrived, probably through a hotline with that gigantic leap of faith, that this stranger out there says they can help, so I'm going to come, not really knowing what it's all about, for within your first hour to be told that you're given permission to speak up if you have issue with something can be very empowering, and do a lot to help them, have the right, hopefully kind of have the right mind frame going in of what your program can offer and how they can interact with it. And then you want to back up this point by being conscious of how you speak of the grievance process, that it's not something that staff hopes to receive, but if there's any issue, we want it resolved as soon as possible, and please speak up. To avoid it being perceived as a placating gesture, an established time frame for how quickly management follows up should be provided whenever a grievance form is turned in, so they know that they're not just sending a paper or a complaint out into the void, and that there is a set time that they can expect to hear back by. And it's a great stress test for the rules you have in place. If the resident is still unhappy at the end of a grievance discussion, look at why that is. Is the grievance out of your control, unable to be altered for a clear reason, or is it worth a re-examination? Now, obviously, one of the greatest challenges to enforcing rules in a residential program is that it's a 24/7 activity with usually many more residents than staff, especially when we're looking at programs that can't afford or choose not to have staff there all the time, perhaps on weekends overnight. No, we don't want staff, in that place of burnout where all they're doing is watching surveillance cameras like a guard. Regular walkthroughs and being present and available around the building can do a lot in picking up on any issues, but odds are at least some of the news of rules being violated is going to be reported secondhand by another resident of staff. And that's where you really need to thread that needle. You shouldn't dismiss a resident's report of an issue or concern, but staff shouldn't rely entirely on hearsay to make a consequential decision as asking someone to leave the program. Putting aside the possibility that it could be an intentional falsehood, eyewitness accounts aren't always reliable, so at the very least, you want the perspective input of staff before coming to a decision. Now, on paper, that's straightforward enough, but here's a prime example of how burnout can have a direct relationship on your shelter's ability to build an understanding with residents about the importance of your program's rules. Let's say a resident comes to a shelter office and shares that the roommate drank a beer in the room before ultimately threatening them with violence. Now, depending on what you're defining as a deal breaker, that's possibly 2 direct violations: alcohol on the premises, threat of physical violence. But the advocate here in the story was in the office. Didn't witness it directly, can't say for sure that it happened. And if that advocate is feeling drained, if they're currently feeling averse to handling the residential conflict, if they're just counting down the minutes until their shift is over, it's a really easy option to respond with something along the lines of, yes, you're right, those are deal breakers, but since staff didn't witness it, we can't do anything about it. Now, I can almost guarantee you that the message that's going to spread through your shelter like wildfire in that instance is there are no consequences as long as staff don't see it. And this is going to empower those already dismissive of rules to act more brazenly, as well as demoralizing those that appreciate the role that rules play in keeping everyone safe. And with time, they're going to stop alerting staff to issues occurring because they feel staff is dismissive, powerless, or both. So what's the solution then? You go follow up. You check in with the other party. You broach the subject not as a direct accusation, but acknowledgement that some kind of conflict is clearly occurring. Now, that can be a scary thing to do, especially as a newer advocate. Traditional training and role-playing might be necessary for this step to feel comfortable. But any number of productive outcomes can come out of it. You're demonstrating that staff do care and will do due diligence if something comes to their attention. If an incident did occur, something might occur out of the conversation to confirm it for staff. And it could also lead to a mediation where the conflict is resolved between the 2 residents. And if nothing else, staff can document the details of the whole interaction, and as a collective program, you can see if a theme emerges. If multiple staff are being told by multiple residents that someone is breaking a rule, that will warrant with actual reason a need to more closely keep an eye on the situation as opposed to over-surveilling it, just because you're just focused on catching people that are breaking rules. Finally, let's talk about what happens, if it's been determined that a resident has broken a rule or series of rules that would necessitate asking them to leave the program. Now, if you've been putting in the work on the previous topics we've been discussing here, it will hopefully be easier to frame this as a natural consequence of actions rather than a punitive gesture. But you seem to be very conscious about the process. For starters, you ideally want to do this with multiple staff present, or at least have an on-call supervisor very clued into the situation so they can provide whatever support is needed. Exiting a resident can be a very difficult task for any advocate, regardless of the amount of experience they hold. Because just really think about what you're asking an advocate to do, and what you're asking a survivor to do and asking them to leave. You're asking someone in an extremely vulnerable position who's been relying on your program in numerous ways to leave, possibly to an unknown next step. And that's a significant burden, a necessary burden in this context, but still one you don't want on one single advocate's shoulders. And for that reason, I'd strongly advise someone in management being involved in the decision, even if it's just to confirm, yes, this is the correct step, you're making the right decision for the greater good of the program. And that kind of extra approval step and sharing the load, kind of the emotional burden of the decision will ensure that staff aren't, choosing not to follow up and enforce rules out of that fear, out of the fear of, I can't do this to this person. If you work as a team, you can share it, you can process it, and those advocates can go home knowing that, while it was a difficult decision, it's one that they can feel that was made with, with logic and understanding, and that more than one person agreed with them. So having it be a collective decision is really important just for everyone's mental health, which is just, good self-care in general in this work. And from a trauma-informed standpoint, having more than one staff member involved means that the survivor isn't hearing, "We still want to help you," from the same person who says, "You have to leave." And I know this approach can be characterized as good cop, bad cop, but more than anything, I think it's an effort to avoid the impression of gaslighting, which we know is a common tactic of abusers. So you want to have that grievance paperwork ready when informing them exit, as direct acknowledgement they might feel differently. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the grievance needs to be addressed by a staff member before they exit the program. You can have them provide contact information, and ensure them that someone will follow up the next day, on the personal cell, email, however they want to be reached, when they're no longer in the shelter. And this validates their voice and provides assurance that their view will be heard, even if they're no longer able to stay. And I fielded a number of calls from survivors on this scenario, and with around a quarter of them, the conversation boiled down to, hearing from them, "I'm not trying to come back. I just need to understand my experience, why it felt unfair or wrong," with a request for assurance that changes will occur for the sake of others that go through your program. And depending on the situation, when reviewed after the fact, that might be the correct action. We always want to be looking for gaps in our service, and early exits tend to highlight them if they're there. And the resident you're asking to leave, the review will almost certainly be critical. How can it not be? How can they not take it personally? You're taking away vital resources at a time they're needed most, and there's no staff perspective that's going to change that fact. But you can't match that energy, because doing so will completely undermine the idea of it being a natural consequence of their actions. They will leave and always believe, understandably, that they were exited for a personal reason rather than a professional one. And you can emphasize the professionalism by giving them, some extra grace and extra gestures. Give them some time to figure out what the next steps are, a few hours or the remainder of the night if the incident occurs late in the evening. You can provide them with a list of other resources and referrals, and offer to assist with a custom safety plan if they're open to it. A message of, "We're sorry that you can't stay here, but we want to help you figure out where you're going next." So they don't have the impression that, the program doesn't care if they're just out on the streets. We care about where you're going next. We just are no longer a viable option. And if the reaction is, "I hear you, but leave me alone," or any variation of that, respect that space. And just check in periodically in relation to determined times they need to leave by. Make sure that they're actually beginning to pack up and that they're heading out. But if, and they're on track to head out when you've asked them to head out. But if they don't want staff involvement beyond that, you got to respect that, with maybe one final attempt at offering to assist. And you really do, no matter how upset they are with you, no matter how, how contentious or argumentative the process is, make sure that they hear the hotline is still available if they need anything in the future. Because the last thing we want is for a survivor to think they're no longer worthy of receiving professional support and services because of a particular instance and a particular moment of their life. Everyone deserves the support to gain a violence-free life, and we don't want to pass a message to any survivor that they've somehow lost that opportunity. Now, the exception to any number of these rules is safety. So if the nature of the rule breaking is really extreme, or there's concerns that, the situation is going to be unsafe after informing the resident of exit, or they need, extra precautions when informing them. If the resident's facilities are impaired in a way that they're not going to understand what's going on, use the most appropriate community resources to expedite getting them off the premise, for the sake of everyone's safety, and let some of these steps go by the wayside if they're not going to actually, help anyone, but just exacerbate the situation or put someone in a dangerous place. So that's a very basic overview, obviously, of a trauma-informed rule structure, and I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone might have right now. I also will be accessible post-webinar if you want to reach out, and request a more in-depth training on any of the information covered today. Okay. Do you have any guidance on how to handle the additional rules and policies all shelters are having to put in place due to the current health crisis? Man, what a relevant one. So, I think, wow, I should have seen this coming. So I think it's tricky. And I think it's tricky first and foremost because I think we can all acknowledge that we're all kind of unsure what's happening day to day. So I think my best guidance on how to handle those additional rules and policies around the current health crisis is to certainly, prioritize safety, but as much as you can, prioritize the reason for doing it. So possibly tying your policy about, precautions around a pandemic to say what metro is reporting on what phase the city's in. So it's kind of up to you to determine what your level of safety is and what you need to keep the particulars of your program safe. I would just tie it to a larger discussion going on, so residents can, if residents are curious about when a rule might change, they can, you can say to them, we are following this timeline of Metro. So when Metro says this, we're going to change that. So that way, while they might not be happy with the rule, they do understand that it's not you just arbitrarily saying something, that you are trying to base it off of a larger understanding, a piece of education, and that, they can look to other resources and other education to have a sense of when you yourself are going to change rules. So it doesn't feel like you are just kind of arbitrarily holding that power, but that you're connecting it to, something logical and pragmatic. Good question though, James. Yes, so certainly I am happy to provide the PowerPoint. I will put up my personal information here. I know that this recording will be, this is being recorded and we'll put on YouTube later on the Coalition's YouTube channel. So certainly if you would like the particular slides, you're welcome to email me, or maybe we can have those slides go out with a certificate today. Is there additional re-traumatization when the advocate has to exit a participant? Could you explain a little bit more what you mean by that, Oriana? I'd really appreciate it. Oh, sorry. Now I'm reading. Yes. Unfortunately, there probably is going to be re-traumatization when an advocate has to exit a participant. And I think that's something that we really need to be mindful of, and that's not something that we can be casual about. While we're probably not going to establish true trust, in the time that you're working with a resident, you are asking residents to, in a large degree, to go out on a leap of faith, to leave the situation they're in, to go to your program, to have faith that you're going to be able to keep them safe and help them continuing on to a violence-free life. And if you suddenly say, sorry, we can't do that anymore, I'd imagine, certainly for a certain person that would be re-traumatizing, because it's a betrayal, it's an additional betrayal of trust. And that's unfortunate, but I mean, that speaks to why we have to be very serious about, and not casual about when we exit someone. But as well, the idea behind this training is hopefully if they understand that it is a consequence of their actions and that the program is not upset with them and taking it personally, we're just having to follow rules, hopefully that will reduce the level of re-traumatization that might occur. How do you use trauma-informed care when enforcing rules for safety? Well, I think tying it to something. I think the importance is having rules being tied clearly to this rule's in place because of this. I feel like your rules are going to lose their trauma-informed lens if the consequence is disproportional to the rule, to the action of breaking the rule. Or if a rule is in place seemingly just because it's a rule. Like I said before, if you can't clearly explain why a rule is in place and what it's for, then it's an issue either with how you're explaining it or the rule itself. Great questions, everyone. Okay. How can we address pressure from other agencies when shelter staff has made a decision to not bring a client in a shelter based on safety concerns, serious breaches of confidentiality? I'm just reading it over again myself, Darlene, so I can answer it the best I can. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think that again, again, having clear logic and the reason behind your rules will allow you to resist that pressure because you know yourself that you're in the right. So if you know that, we are, we're not bringing in a client because it affects the safety of our program in some way, it affects the safety of staff, it affects the safety of residents, I understand that the pressure might not still feel good, and that can still be a difficult thing to manage, but you yourself can kind of have the faith and knowledge of like, regardless of how this pressure feels, we know we're making the right decision, because safety is something, at least in my experience, working in residential, safety is something that, for me is easy to go back on of, I might not like it, but nothing is more important than the safety of everyone involved. So I think that having a trauma-informed approach allows you to better communicate your reasoning if you're facing pressure. But as well, even if the pressure persists, you can at least tell yourself, well, this pressure doesn't feel comfortable, but we are confident about why we're making the decision. Good question. How can you handle a situation when someone's hygiene needs improvement, conditions of a room? Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that kind of comes into what I was talking about earlier of, community guidelines. I think, as a program and as staff and as management, you have to figure out where the flexibility lies, so in figuring out when is a state of a room at a point where it's beyond just, wow, this is messy and we'd like it cleaner, and kind of goes to a place of, this might be a health concern, or this could be, an issue that might, I don't know, for example, like if someone's leaving food everywhere, it could attract, rodents and pests and stuff. So I think that with that, I think it's a matter of having a private, certainly, to avoid embarrassment, conversation with, the resident if you feel like it's reached that point, and kind of explain, you can frame it as part of larger community guidelines of talking about, like, we understand everyone has different standards of cleanliness. We're not trying to judge, but because we're in a community space, because others are involved, we need, because we don't want to, we need to have a basic standard. Now, I will acknowledge that could be an uncomfortable conversation, but I think as long as you're rooting it in, we need to make this work as a community rather than just, we think that, you are XYZ. Hopefully to make it a little bit easier for them to understand that, again, you're looking at you're just looking out for the greater good, rather than trying to single someone out just to make them feel bad. Great questions, everyone. Are there any others? How would be the best way to handle a client who's gone behind staff's request not to give legal advice to other residents? Carol, would you mind either now, or we can do it off webinar? Could you explain a little bit more what you mean by that? I see. Okay, I see. Okay, gotcha. So a survivor has a paralegal degree, and they are giving legal advice to other residents despite you asking them. That's a great. Oh, that's a specific. I think that with that, I would. My personal approach is that I would certainly start by acknowledging, that the survivor clearly has knowledge and understanding, and that's great. We certainly don't want them to either, feel bad for offering their services or diminish the fact that they have those skills, in the idea of keeping things empowering. I think beyond that, I would just frame it as, everyone is in this program because they want to receive services, and support from this program. And the easiest way to do that is to have it be, as streamlined and as focused as possible. So that while we appreciate that you have these talents, while we appreciate that you're trying to help, you bringing advice in that might contradict or does not fully align with the pace in which your staff are helping clients can disrupt those efforts. So, while acknowledging that it's good intentioned, you acknowledge, like, look, people only have so much time in this program. We want to keep things as focused as possible, and bringing in, outside knowledge, however valid, can disrupt that process and make things harder for us to accomplish what we want to accomplish with this person while they are in our program. Off the top of my head, Carol, I think that's the best answer I'd have for that. Hold on, everyone. I want to answer. I'm happy to hang along as you guys want. Is losing track. All right. Some clients are cleaning and complain about others. However, we have no idea who it is or is not daily, and we don't want to use a sign-in sheet if possible. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that I know how to solve the issue of a messy shelter. When I worked in a shelter, I always joked that the person that could figure out how to keep communal kitchens clean deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. So I think that, honestly, I could do a whole training on this topic alone, but I think my condensed answer, simple answer would be that, again, trying to tie cleanliness back to, the community rather than kind of a punitive, let's find the person who is doing it, because one, that will hopefully diffuse some of the tension and kind of shift energy from who's responsible to how can we fix this. And obviously, it's hard to form a community in a shelter when people are coming and going, and they obviously have other things, very pressing things going on. But I think to the extent that we can encourage residents to take pride in the idea that the shelter is a community, that can do a lot for them to take pride in the space, which will hopefully do, something about the cleanliness. Great. Are there any other questions? Either new ones or ones that I may have missed that you want to reiterate right now? And Carol, certainly I'm happy to talk with you later about that particular issue. Okay, well, if there are no other questions at this time, my contact information is up there. And I am always happy and available to either do kind of one-on-one discussion about any issues. I'm always happy to, speak directly with your program and customize a training for exactly what you're working on. So this was definitely a taste, but I am available, very available, and I have all the time in the world because I'm, quarantining at home. So please feel free to reach out if I can do anything for you. And I really thank you all for attending and being such a great audience today. So thank you all. Thank you all so much for the work that you do here in this field in our state. And I wish everyone a wonderful, safe day. Take care.